from me. One is I sent this out by Canvas, but I uploaded a quick thing about me. So if you're curious at all about me, because I got a few emails about me, so if you're curious, it's up there. And obviously, like if you want to talk, let me know. It sounds like we have critical mass for VR lab tours, so I'll start scheduling that somehow. Just note that most of them do happen on Fridays. I know that there's ODT seminar and all kinds of other things, so I'll figure out how to schedule this as a point. It sounds like we don't have there wasn't a critical mass for board game night tomorrow, but we'll talk at the end of class about the game critique that's due on Wednesday. And my office is full of board games, so if anybody needs a board game or anything, after class, let me know and we'll hook you up. So, and if you're interested in board games beyond this assignment, Friday night in Barnum, there is the official graduate school education board game night. So,
is that every Friday?
Once a month.
Sure.
Cool. All right. Any questions on logistics or anything before we roll into this? All right. Awesome. All you, buddy. Bless you.
So the readings, what did you guys think? Yeah? Let's go through and quickly talk about each of these, because there's a lot of them, but I want to get people's kind of overall thoughts on these, because I was reading some of the responses, and some of them I think were hitting with people. What did you think about the fairness? Does that have a place in games? Does it have a place in education?
Well, to me, almost like all these other ones almost go under fairness. Because I think the first thing people think about when they're engaging in a game is this going to be fair? Like, do I have a chance to win? And if they don't, they can sort of almost feel it intuitively right away, and then they're not going to want to play if it's not fair, or if it's way out of balance.
That's a good point. There's I remember when a friend of mine was playing with a chess computer. This was like a long time ago when it was like the chess board was like the computer. And he was starting to get to the upper levels of it, and then he was like, dude, this game's cheating. You know? And he figured out that for it to get above a certain level, this is way before the Google, chess computers, was it had to start cheating. And it had to start giving itself advantages. And people look at fairness as kind of player versus player or a multiplayer game, but fairness against the system, I think you hit on, everything really does go along with that.
One of the things I thought was interesting was just like the idea that like sometimes a fair game is not necessarily symmetrical. Like because if you're trying to like recreate something that's more real life or something like that, like you initially when you say fairness, I think like, oh, this has got to match the skills immediately. But like the example of the World War II, like situation, especially like early on, like there's definitely a balance shifted, and so if you were trying to make it fair, it wouldn't like fair in what I think of like matched opponents, then it doesn't necessarily. It might still be like fair match like opponent wise, but it wouldn't be fair like to think of that as like, hey, this is how it should feel. In the same way with like the 4 ghosts versus 1 for Pac-Man, like like. 1 ghost versus 1 Pac-Man, like you're like 1-to-1. Oh, that seems fair, but it really doesn't. A fair game like that, where it's like that, isn't necessarily fun. And sometimes it's fun to like win as the underdog or win as when it is asymmetrical.
Right. So just for an example, I've studied the Eastern Front in World War II a lot with the Soviets versus the Germans, and when you game that. The game tends to deal with fairness in a way that you play different scenarios. So if we're playing a game and we're playing a scenario that takes place in 41, and I'm the Germans are going to start to roll over the Soviets. That's how it went. If it didn't go that way, it would seem wrong, and we kind of accept from history that's how it goes. So either you play the game like that, and they shift the victory points around, so the onus is on me to take more space and to basically destroy more of your divisions, or you win, or it keeps things the same, but it means that you have to be a better player to beat me. So if you stay kind of balanced or beat me, you must be a much better player than I am. But if I roll over you, it doesn't necessarily say a whole lot, because that's what 1941 and 1942 was like. Also, games will say, you know, we'll do the whole campaign where it's 1941 to 1945, and there's a lot of back and forth that happened right there, so they figure that things are going to even out. Especially historical games will start to do that a lot.
Yeah.
You had a comment or question?
Oh yeah, I was just thinking about my own experience when I've been playing games or I've been observing other people play games, and how frustrating it is for them when they've been playing, when the rules change all of a sudden, or when there's a sudden advantage, or...
Can you give me an example of that?
I'm thinking of an example where some people were playing a game, and there was a newer person, and the people were helping the newer person. And then someone else came along who was more experienced to help the newer person, and the newer person just won. So they were, like, originally the people were like, oh, we're being cooperative and helping this person, and kind of understanding the limitations of what to expect. And then when something new and unexpected happens, it totally kind of alters what they were planning for. Especially in something that's kind of strategy oriented, it can be really frustrating.
Okay.
Like I'm wondering, like, would someone ever play a game if they know they were going to lose? And the answer is oftentimes yes. For example, like someone talked about an inequality game, right? You know you're going to lose, but it teaches you a lesson. And like another example would be like in high school, like sports team, like the coach made the varsity guys go against the JV guys. And obviously the JV guys are going to lose, but through that experience, they're meant to like bond and kind of develop connections.
Okay.
And they're often very willing to do that, even though they knew they were going to lose. So it's kind of like you have to be mindful of kind of the purpose of this game, because there's often a larger purpose to it, right? That's beyond just like surface level fairness.
It's good. I like the JV versus because I hadn't thought about that before in football. Something that several people have kind of brought up that I want to make sure that we all understand is that fairness typically becomes a problem when people don't mention it. When your assumption is that something that you're playing is fair, and you're like, hey, the chess computer is cheating, that's kind of lame. Now, if this person had read, my friend had read in the rule book that, like, well, once it gets above, difficulty level 6, it's going to start taking liberties. And you know that unless the JV team just kicks butt, that they're gonna lose. Everyone knows that going in, and so everyone's able to reset their expectations a little bit.
Your point really resonates. I was involved with a card gaming company, and basically it's a partner card game. And initially the players were complaining that if my partner was a computer, that it was like ruining the whole game. They weren't playing well at all, and they just had no skill. So the AI of the computer was so bad. So what we did is we're like, all right, since it's the computer, it can kind of figure out, or it kind of knows what all the other cards of all the other players are, and can basically be the most awesome partner you can imagine because it just knows all the players.
Mm-hmm.
And the players figured it out. And we were just wondering how did they figure it out, and the backlash was unbelievable. It was just because you, like you said, you weren't clear about that the computer partner is basically a cheater and has that edge on the game.
Right. And there's kind of some cognitive dissonance there of you play a game against a computer, and of course the computer can cheat. Of course the computer knows everything, but you assume that there's a level playing field, and I'm not really sure why we do, but we do.
I also thought the asymmetrical point where you can have there was some game I was playing once where it's you can have different magical powers, right? You can either have the invisibility cloak or the wand or whatever. And it seemed like that laid the groundwork very well for then that, the emergent complexity theory. Much better, right? Because there's already strategy from the very first kind of playing field.
Right. Okay.
There's a game called Super Smash Brothers, which is a brilliant example.
Yes, there is.
And so there are different characters in this game that move in different ways. And the basic objective is to try to knock the other characters off of the playing field. And there's certain characters which people have determined are just cheat characters because they feel like the characters are not balanced. Like their ability is somehow like if you can figure out a way to like hack the way that you play them, such that it becomes very difficult to beat those characters. And so in tournament play, you'll find that people don't allow those characters to be used; they get excluded. And I think it's a really good example of a lot of what we're talking about. Just sort of the ways that people even come up with outside of the game itself when they play in these official tournaments to balance the game according to like things that the developer didn't even really anticipate in terms of this emergent gameplay. So like the emergent gameplay comes about and then people try to rebalance again in order to make it fair in a tournament setting.
So someone in here, and I don't know who it is, used to be a tournament Dota 2 player.
I play Dota 2.
Yeah?
There's nothing to be ashamed of.
Yeah, don't be ashamed. So if you haven't heard this game, it's a multiplayer 5-on-5 game, and it's still one of the most popular games in the world. It has about 16 million daily active users in the game. At any time, 5.7 million games are going on. Ever run into any balance issues?
Yeah, I mean, throughout the game's history, it's probably the thing that people talk about more than any one other aspect of the game. And I mean, now it's usually more called meta than balance. But I mean, basically every time a new patch comes out, the first thing people do is look for the character that's the most imbalanced, and that's called the meta character because statistically, teams that pick that more often are more likely to win. So you want to make sure you have somebody on your team who has that character.
Interesting. There's someone who had a...
So I started this conversation saying about how all of the issues actually relate to fairness. Actually, from my point of view, all of the issues related to that flow idea. And I think the reason people care about fairness is because if there's no fairness, they have no chance to win, so they can't be in flow. Because you're always going to be in high anxiety because it's always going to be too hard. There's just like no chance for you to actually complete that task. That was my...
Agree, disagree?
Yeah, so what I think is like the most difficult element in game design is not necessarily not necessarily how to make a game interesting for players of like different skill levels to play together, but more so like how to keep the player on the middle of like I think they call it the flow channel of experiencing like challenges and successes in proper balance. So it's like I view like the making the game interesting and challenging for players at different skill levels, like that's almost kind of like a more of an extrinsic motivation of sorts, whereas keeping the player in the flow channel is kind of intrinsic. And I know like the author mentioned kind of like different solution techniques for flow channel. I think he said something along the lines of like increasing difficulty with success, letting players go through easy parts first before you give them some stumbling blocks, letting players choose the difficulty level they want to play at, and also the importance of testing the game, like allotting a lot of time, not just to get the game to work, but testing it with like a variety of players.
So I want to talk about flow for a second. Flow gets talked about like it's this kind of perfect Zen moment that people are trying to get to in games, and it's not really true. When I'm working on a game, I do not want people to sit there in the flow state the whole time. It doesn't exist. It's counterproductive. I'm looking for something more like this. It's like, you ever been to an action movie where it's like an hour and 40 minutes of freaking action, and there's not a talking scene in the whole stupid movie, and you get done and you're just like, I need a cigarette. I don't even smoke. Okay. When I used to watch, you remember the TV show Alias back in the day? So yeah, Sidney Bristow's a bomb. So I used to watch that with my wife, and I would be like, how can she be like firing guns in Russia, and then like 5 minutes later she's like sitting down with her girlfriend and having a glass of wine, and they're talking about like boy problems. And then it hit me. It's like that's what makes the action scenes so interesting and real is that she's a real character. She's not an automaton. And so you get these highs, but you also get these emotional lows, and it brings you back to a central location, but it doesn't stay there. If it was all about her being human, or it was all about her being a programmed assassin, it would be boring. So you have to go up and you have to go down. When I'm doing level design, I worked for a while in a game called Diner Dash, and we would have these restaurants. You'd have like 5 restaurants in the game, and each restaurant would have 10 levels, and of course I would put secret levels that people could find in there. And what you want to do in each restaurant is when you start off, it's all new for people. It's like, oh, you're in the pizzeria now. Oh my God, it's so new. And you want to kind of go easy on people, but then you start ramping up the difficulty and you start giving them some new things, like, oh, they're kids now, and if you don't pay attention to the kids, they're going to knock the water over and make everyone mad at the tables next to them. The baby's going to start crying. But at some point, before you get to the end of that restaurant, you have to kind of level that a little bit, and then you give people like a big thing at the end where everything new that you taught them, you put all in one thing, and you get to this level of difficulty. But when you get to the next restaurant, you can't just keep doing that, or it's going to get too hard. When you get to this next restaurant, now you have the swanky seafood restaurant, you have to bump it down a little bit because they already have something new to deal with, a new background. And I dealt with this a lot because by the 3rd or 4th iteration of the game, you had people starting the game who it was the first level they'd ever played of Diner Dash in their life, and there were other people who'd been playing it for months or even years, and they had probably 500 hours behind them. And so you have to figure out where people are on this difficulty ramp. It's kind of a fascinating challenge. Kind of a funny story is that we had to figure out how to increase challenge without increasing difficulty. And so one day I was sitting around and we have like the restaurants. If you ever played the game, like everyone's all standing in line, and there's a thing back here where the chef's making the food, and there's tables, and you seat people, and Flo is running around like a chicken with their head cut off. And it's like, how do you make this game more challenging for people who have put 500 hours into it, but don't make it too difficult for people who've never played it before? And so I made a level where the people came in on the right side of the restaurant instead of the left side of the restaurant. And the people who had never played the game before were like, okay, who cares? I grabbed people from the right and grabbed people from the left. And the people who had put 500 hours into the game like freaked out. Because they're like, it's like chess, and you told me the queen doesn't exist anymore. And it's basically, that's the sort of balance that we deal with in games, that we also deal with in educational, is how do you make things more challenging, but you can't keep ramping the difficulty up until you hit the stratosphere. Anything else about flow? Because I feel like that's an important one.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to say that I used a real-life Diner Dash in a classroom to teach a vocabulary about food.
You did?
It was really fun for them.
Wow.
They had different, I just made them play the game, basically. So some people had the role of being the customers, and then a couple people had to be the waiters and bring all the food, and some people had to be the chefs and stuff.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, it was fun.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think what's interesting with the ramp up and then the plateau is like it feels like that's like a point to like have the user enjoy the new skill, right? Like, so it's not necessarily you know, so like the tension's kind of gone, and now
this is it right here. That's the okay.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, like Zelda when you get a new item, and then all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of things to use the item on, and then after a while you like forget that it's new, and then you got to ramp it up. So what you're saying is like, was it in that kind of plateau state where you move the line from the other side? Is that where you're trying to like keep it interesting, or was that just on the subsequent level?
This is like individual levels, 1 through 10 in a restaurant, and then you go to the next restaurant and you have 10 more levels. So you kind of do this each time, but once you get to this level at the end of restaurant 1, you have to dumb it down a little bit at the start of the next one, just so you can start that, because it's going to start an upward climb up to there again. And you're going to get much, much higher. The other interesting thing that we would do would be 3 or 4 levels throughout the game, say one right here, and one right here, and maybe one right here. We would make almost impossible levels. My only requirement was that someone in the company had to be able to finish the level. It could have been me, it could have been one of the testers. Someone had to complete the level, and I would get so much trouble from the director, from the business directors, because they would say like, you're making these too hard. But what they don't realize is that when these come out and people run into these almost impossible levels, where are they going to go? The internet. So then it starts lighting up where everyone's starting to talk about these things, because even though it's a single player game and there's nothing, in the early versions there was nothing multiplayer about it at all, is you want to bring people out to start talking about the game, to start cycling back in.
Was that a random choice where the level appeared, or did you?
No,
also
it's just
try
how I
to-
design levels. I would usually be kind of an overall charge of level design, and then I would take some of them on myself to design by hand. And I would just pick and say, usually pick one that was already pretty hard, and just say, you need 47,000 to finish it expert mode. What about 51? And the QA director would say, you're a jerk, and I would say, cool, go do it, 51, and you would do that. And we would tape it just in case people would come back and say, you can't do that.
You got to do it twice within 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. What did you think about the meaningful choices in here? Did anyone have any thoughts on that?
I thought it was very similar to the discussion in education about, you have to give students choices, but oftentimes the choices aren't that meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
That they're things that students either don't want to do anyway, or they're like the example in the book, like you can choose the red car or the blue car, but they don't do anything different. And so then it's important to, I think also as an educator, to know how to actually not just pretend to give choices, but give real choices, just the same as a game designer.
So that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that about education, because I see that sometimes even in educational games of you have things that are kind of fun and they put some interesting production values in it, but the choices aren't really that interesting. When we talk about the core loop, when you're doing your assignment, make sure that you're looking for choices and making sure that you're designing choices that are actually meaningful. If you create a core loop and you create a reward, but the reward isn't rewarding and the choices aren't meaningful, it's not really a loop.
I don't really understand. I think the games that I've found to be the most enjoyable are the ones where there are multiple pathways to victory or multiple definitions of victory. And I think that's when the meaningful choices actually become meaningful. So,
Can you think of an example of one of those, maybe?
Civilization, you can do like a cultural victory, or you can do a military victory. Settlers of Catan, you can get a whole bunch of knights, or you can get longest road, or you can have points. So, multiple ways to win in both situations.
And so that works for single player when you're just playing that against a computer. It also works in a social situation when you're playing an online game or you're playing a board game like Settlers, because we could be playing and I think that I'm winning and you think that you're winning and we're both right. Okay, we're both winning in different ways. That's interesting. When you encounter those things, when I use particular pieces of educational software that aren't built with that in mind. They're built with a particular straight path in mind. Those things don't exist because you're kind of designing those out instead of designing them in. Anything else on meaningful choices?
I'm trying to think about what a meaningful choice is in an educational context. And most of the ones that I'm thinking about, I feel like are very difficult to engineer. Like, I'm thinking in particular about, like, there are multiple ways to solve a math problem, for instance, or to answer a question around, like, say you're taking, like, playing a game that's related to economics. You know, there could be various ways to explain some change in growth rate of a country, and so that could be multiple ways for you to answer this question correctly. But I think that being able to allow for those multiple answers to exist in the game requires, it's no longer a like multiple choice kind of scenario. Now you have to have a game that allows you to understand different, in the math context, maybe different proofs, or in the economic context, like just know that there are multiple different like sorts of answers and be able to decipher them and not be looking for a specific one.
That's a hard one. In a lot of education that I've encountered, you're either right or you're wrong.
Right.
And in games, that's not always the case. You know, when you think about the triangulation part, there's two choices that are right, and one of them's better, or there's two choices that are wrong, and one of them's worse. That's an interesting problem that I don't know the answer to. But I think it's one that we should be thinking about.
Or maybe you allow for the gray area, and I think what you just said is actually really helpful. Like, is there a way for you to like allow a student never to feel like they're right or wrong, but that they're like understand where the logic is wrong and where the logic was right, you know? Like, you're in the right track in this way of thinking about this, but this part of the way that you responded is wrong, maybe, or I don't know.
If I was in the middle of a room of people that could potentially be changing education in America and in this world, and I am, it would be interesting to have an experiment where you're trying to teach something to someone and you have a way to test it and track it, and in one way you use a technique that we already understand, and another way you introduce very much of a gray area, something that seems counterintuitive, that shouldn't work, and see if it does work.
Well, I think what I thought was interesting, just this idea of like the terminology of dominant strategy, because I think that's kind of what it is the educational designer has like this dominant strategy, like to get to this answer, this is the path you have to take, and so they're going to design like a course to go, I'm going to lead you along this path so that you actually get to where I think you need to be and how I think you need to be. Whereas if like, you know, you could think differently. I don't know what the answer is, but think like maybe here's where we want to get to, but like be cognizant of that of our bias, that our dominant strategy of this is how I normally teach students to get to this point, but what other ways are there out there? You know, it might be lend itself easier in different domains, like, you know, I don't know, like there's some like mathematical proofs, for example, that could be solved like a couple different ways, and then there's some that like we've only figured out one way how to solve this or how to like prove it so far. So you kind of got to go through that. But I think like as you're designing it, to think of, you know, what's my implicit bias like pointing that's like, you know, kind of negating these other strategies that might be equally valid.
Just 1 second. This is an important one. 20 or 30 years ago, I think you could be a designer of a game and have a big ego because you were designing something that someone was going to be taking in, like a movie. You know, movies don't have agency, so you can kind of do whatever you want. And back then, where else are you're going to experience it from talking to your friends and your peers, and there's going to be an article in a magazine about it. And now, when a game comes out, and you know a new character comes out in Dota 2, and there's literally 50 million people. I was reading somewhere that they had one update that was sucking up 3% of the global internet traffic for people trying to grab that update. You have a lot of people jumping onto the and if I have 200 QA people over here testing it, but over here there are 200 million people playing it, who's going to figure out the exploits first? So you have to lose, as a designer, as a game designer, and I think as an educational designer, although I'm not sure, you have to lose some of that ego and assuming that you have the right answers, because emergent gameplay used to be relatively small, unless it was designed in, and now emergent gameplay is so much of what exists, because you're just trying to, right now, you're just trying to create a system, especially with an online game, that doesn't collapse of its own weight. I could show you spreadsheets that I've found that aren't from a company of like, you know, online games where people have created huge spreadsheets of what the economy of this game is like. It's basically the same sort of spreadsheet that I would create when I'm designing a game economy. People have just done this in their spare time because I guess they're bored. But for me, I'm kind of geeky about it. It's kind of cool that someone's taking the time to do this. Anyway, I just want to talk about that with the ego thing of the emergent gameplay. You had a comment or question?
Oh, I was going to ask what people think about Oregon Trail. Because I feel like that, you know, like an old educational technology game, you did get to make choices. There was an amount of risk, and I feel like I don't know, maybe the dominant strategy was to start out as a doctor, but I feel like there was, were those meaningful choices? That was my question about
Anyone?
Definitely.
Definitely, I think so. I mean, because you could like lose the game, you could die, right? Like based on a choice that you made, and there was no restart.
Right.
You know, you have to start all over again from the beginning.
But then coming back to the question of fairness, once Tiny Colin figured out the advantages of starting in certain places or in certain professions or with certain items, I would try in a different place or with a different profession or with different items to see if I could do it. So, of course, the internet wasn't the competing force.
Am I the only person who asked their parents what dysentery was after the game?
It's how you die in Oregon.
I'm just thinking about meaningful choices and who you are in the game, because I actually think I fall now as an adult into like the killer category.
Interesting.
I know. But as a kid, I was, and specifically with Oregon Trail, like I was in the context of kid who I knew I was gonna die. As soon as like the river came along, I was gonna drown. And so that was a thing that like I never particularly played to win. I kind of played in the explorer camp. And so in that way, the choices didn't feel terribly meaningful. And so like, do certain identities of players need that meaningful choice more than others? Because that to me, it's like,
That's an interesting one. I think this still happens because the better computer horsepower gets, the more complicated people make their graphics. But there was a certain time, I don't know, like 5, 10, 15 years ago, where people were making games that were definitely would only work on the best of the computers. And you had to decide, do you want to turn your graphic settings way down and have a high frames per second? Or do you want to make them look beautiful and the game runs at like 4 or 6 frames a second? And aesthetically, I'm saying, I'm an explorer, I want the game to look beautiful, I don't want to dumb. And there's other people that are like, you're stupid, you're going to lose. Because I'm going to be able to literally turn faster than you. Because my game's running at 60 frames per second, and I've basically brought it down to like flat shaded pixels. And there's something in there, and it's how you experience the game. Do you want to experience the game to dominate it or win it, or do you want to experience it out as it was designed to, quote unquote?
Going back to the educational games and choices, I was thinking of how the high-risk questions could come into play to an educational game, where like get this granularity into an educational question. How would you do that? So you have like a multiple choice question, which could be like a low stake question, but how do you create a high stakes question where, I don't know, extra credit? Like, describe it more so you get more points. I don't know, just throwing it out there.
So another comment about the choices is Dan Schwartz, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education, is really big in choice assessments, choice-based assessments. And I was reminded during this conversation of something Candace said earlier in the course, where one of the great values of education and technologies is not necessarily getting the students to an outcome, a learning outcome, but seeing them when they're in the platform itself and seeing how they engage in the platform as they move through. And there's a lot of valuable information in there. And so what Schwartz does is design these games where that's really the value that they're getting. It's not as much about like what's the outcome, because the outcome is like paint a picture, or like turn on lights of a different color. But it's how are the students making choices within this game based on a couple different options presented to them, and then that sort of guides the instruction after for the teacher. It's kind of cool.
That kind of petri dish that you talk about there is I probably talked about this before, about how one of the most painful things you can do as a game developer is to watch other people playing your game through a one-way mirror. Where they're in there and they have someone and they're playing it and they're the person they're saying, oh, no one cares what you say whatever you want about the game, and you're in there going, You know, taking notes on stuff, and you'd have to do it a half dozen times before you stop taking it personally. But them playing the game, and that's how I was able to vet the fact that flipping the Diner Dash thing over where you greet people on the right then the left was going to work, because I posited that it did. But I had to put it in front of 3 people who were super experienced and 3 people who were newbies to see how they actually reacted. And I wasn't so concerned about, well, what was their score at the end, but what was that painful process like? And for the people who were new, oh, it's on the right side, cool, it's just another level. And for the people on the left, it was like, what did you do? So that's a really, really good point.
Well, my comment was related to what Lucas was asking about how you might design that. I feel like sometimes when you have educators saying you can do your assignments or you can do this like extra project-based thing for credit, and so that's like high risk. I don't know if it's high risk, it's more like high effort because you're putting in all this effort. It can be high risk if you fail and you don't get it right and you get to be, I don't know, in front of your professor or teacher that you haven't shown that you don't actually understand what's going on. But it can be high reward both intellectually and for grade. I think that's one way. You see that in presentations at the business school a lot. They would say like, oh, whoever, you know, at the end you can present to this guests who are VCs from wherever. And that's kind of high risk, right? Because if you do a bad job, you know, you don't want to appear like a
There's
person
higher
who doesn't.
rewards too, because you get funded or
Exactly,
something.
something like that, yeah.
Well, and I think too, in the nature of education in general, it's like kind of high risk. Just the whole endeavor of education is somewhat high risk. Like we're trying to move students through something, and they've, they've maybe, well, in higher ed they have other places they could be, and so there's just kind of inherent high risk in the system, and then maybe it's made up with a bunch of low risk, high reward things within that system. I like there might be like a hierarchy of things where like it's not necessarily like everything in education is high risk, right? Like we're trying to get high test scores, high performing students, and if you don't, then what happens? Do you get, good job, whatever, maybe not. So maybe the whole system is just high risk anyway.
Yeah, it's a matter of, I see this with startups and NGOs a lot of, we're trying to attack a problem and we're going to test it against the worst problem in the worst place in the world with the least amount of funding, which is its own strategy, and it is what it is. I like to prototype things and test them in the easiest place with the most money, with the best possible people, because that's when you get a chance to see whether it breaks of its own accord. If you use it somewhere really difficult and it breaks, which it probably will, you don't know if it broke because of where you were testing it or what you were testing. That's been a big learning of mine. And we've been dancing around this a little bit, so I want to talk about simplicity versus complexity. When you play games, some games are very simple. Flappy Bird is like about as simple as it gets, and it's this weirdly addictive game. Games like Civilization and going on up to WoW and way more complicated hardcore games are very, very complex. But I found that the best games have at their core a level of simplicity to them. And complexity, to me, good complexity in a game or entertainment experience does not mean adding more things to that core loop. It means adding more things that core loop can potentially drive in the game. I'm sure I've talked to you about this, by the concentric circles, where you have the core loop, and then you have the secondary mechanics, and then you have the progression system, and then you have the narrative, and then you have the art and sound of a game. And this is the whole layers of the onion, and if you change something here, then it's not necessarily that high risk. If you change something here, it is very high risk. The same part also comes into complexity, in that if you add to your core loop and make it more complex, it creates reverberating waves, if you will, throughout your whole system. So what you want to try and find is keeping with the same core loop, is maybe add a secondary mechanic, or better yet, find a way where the core loop can attach to a secondary mechanic, which can add to a new piece into the progression system of the game. Find ways to add complexity out here and keep the core of what you're doing simple. Because when you start to add things here and make it more, it's weird. It's like fracking. Like eventually the thing's going to start to rumble and fall apart. I don't know any other way to describe it.
Do you have an example of like what all of that means kind of concretely? Like how you would build out the secondary mechanic progressive, like for an example game? Like
For an example game?
Yeah.
Core loop of Diner Dash is clicking on a table. Is basically making decisions about where flow is going to move in the game and serving customers. Secondary mechanics are how you're seating people, in what order you're going up to grab orders, because you only have 2 hands unless you're playing a special level where she has 4 hands, and so you can only carry 2 things at once. You can only have 4 things queued up at a time. So secondary mechanics are also when you're going to put dishes away and clean up tables. Secondary mechanics are going to start to get out and move into the progression system where you progress from one restaurant to the other, and while you're inside of a restaurant, you're making improvements to it. You're making it look more beautiful so people give you more tips. You're getting some nice sneakers for Flo so she can actually run faster in the game, starts to go towards progression system. The narrative starts to run into the reason that you're even buying these restaurants in the first place is that Mr. Big, the bad guy, wants to knock all these things down and build a really bad mall with like all the worst mall food in the world, but you're trying to keep these kind of homespun places going. And it goes into the art and sound where Flo is like this super cute kind of character. Like if we're gonna do we always said if we're gonna do a movie, we would have used that. I can't think of the TV show now with the girl, the young woman living with the 3 guys, and she's completely quirky and
Delusional.
Yes, yeah, she's basically Flo. And thinking about when the game first came out, the art was very, very simple, and so while we upped the production values on it, we didn't want to make it 3D. We didn't want to make it crazy beautiful. We wanted to make it true to who the character was, and the sound was always very event-based. Sounds are not in the game to kind of raise the cognition level. They're there to cue you. That's like my 120 seconds of what that's like. Was that helpful at all?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I was surprised not to see glitches, or what I think glitches are, in this reading, or I was wondering where glitches fit in that diagram there, and also in balance, because I originally thought that they were basically just you should never have glitches because they're probably bad. But I'm realizing actually I think glitches, in my understanding of them, can actually add a lot of interesting elements to the game. Like in Dota, there was the one team actually won one of the international tournaments, and the prize pool was $18 million, and they won because of a glitch. So you can imagine how angry the other team would have been for that happening. But the happiness of the other team that the winning team had, just winning based on some glitch that they exploited because of creativity.
That's a really good point. Does everyone know what a glitch is?
No.
Okay, do you want to kind of explain from what your knowledge of a glitch is?
I mean, I would explain it as sort of something that the designers didn't initially intend for. It's some kind of like graphics failure or controls failure in a way that the player is able to exploit. Like in the international tournament, this one character has this move where he throws a meat hook at another character. And it's usually meant to grapple in an enemy hero and brings them into you and you do damage to them. But actually this one team that's really creative, they figured out that if they grappled hooked the enemy hero, and then another person on their team used a teleport ability at the exact moment that the grapple hit the hero, a second later it wouldn't work. If you did that, it would bring everybody right back to your team's fountain, where they would get blasted by a fire tree, and their whole team would die. So it was like this crazy.
That is awesome.
No one had seen that before.
Amazing.
Was that on purpose or by accident?
They figured this out. I mean, I don't know how they must have played it 100 times.
But the game designers didn't put it in on purpose?
No.
Okay.
Now, glitches are basically bugs. I mean, I always knew them as bugs, but people use them as exploits. But there's a difference. An exploit, when you hack, is because you actually hack into the code, or you find an exploit that gives you an advantage because we're actively finding a way. A glitch is more of something that you find that you're able to use. When I was working on the Sims brand, like I don't know, a long time ago, like 12 years ago, I actually had someone say, you need to go into this room. We have 10,000 open bugs in the database right now. Just 10,000, not a big deal. By the time you leave, you need to have it down to 8,500. So I was responsible for closing 1,500 bugs in an afternoon. Okay. Did I go through each of those and test each of them and say, well, now, I guess that we're okay with that? No, you can't. There's literally not time for it. And when you get to the fact that, a development team, even at its biggest, is, 150, 250 people, and, 16 million people are playing Dota every day, they're going to find the glitches first. In fact, there's an Ubisoft game this weekend where the community manager came out and said that, I don't remember what game it was, that we're going to punish these people who use this glitch in the game. Like, we're actually going to punish them. And there was an issue of fairness around that, of these people aren't hackers, they're just, they found glitches in the matrix and they're utilizing them. Any other thoughts around glitches? Because I think that's an interesting one. I find that all the time when I'm doing exercises with people, or they're taking tests, or we're doing any sorts of interactive, someone will find a way to kind of hack their way through it. And maybe they think that they're being clever, or maybe they're being lazy, or maybe a lot of times it's because they're bored. But you can find glitches in just about everything. For me, if you can find ways to make glitches interesting for people and make it feel not punitive, and sometimes kind of throw breadcrumbs in people's way, people like to feel clever. And so as a game designer, I like to give people opportunities to feel clever, even if I didn't distinctly design it in the first place.
So would you ever, what would it be called if you, purposely left, points for divergent thinking like that?
Easter egg?
There are definitely Easter eggs. I've put Easter eggs in games before.
What do you mean?
Easter eggs are things that the game designer hides within the game that isn't necessarily on the surface for every player.
Yeah, there was
but
one
rewards
like Excel or
explorers.
something. You have to press all these commands and suddenly you're in this video.
And so
It's
people
not Excel.
might connect over that on the internet where they
I when I worked on that game I talked about a long time ago, a World War II game where you're flying around, I put several Easter eggs in there because I was doing a lot of campaign and level design I thought no one would ever run into.
Yeah.
And years later I'm going through forums and people are talking and showing screenshots of these things and I'm like, wow, those people were more bored than I was. But it's cool. I put them in there kind of for art's sake. Because I was doing this game and it was really cool, but I also knew a lot about the history, and so I wanted to bring out small pieces of the history as art, and kind of art pieces inside of this game, and people found it.
Really quickly, a really fun Easter egg in Mario Kart 64, which I think most people have played. After you finish the level, there's this kind of elevator jazz music as the credits scroll, and it just will play until you click out of it. But the music repeats, and once it repeats 64 times, the coda, on the 65th time, the music changes. It takes an hour and a half to get there. It's about all the thing is. But Nintendo 64, 64 times. Yeah.
There was just something like that in a recent game where if you let it run for 8 hours, something changed, and so I can't remember what game it was, but it was you had these two choices at the end, and you most people just click out and the credits are in. And if you just let it run for 8 hours, then all of a sudden it takes you deeper into something else. So somewhere somebody was like, let's leave this for 8 hours and see what happens.
We have about 2 more minutes to go through the reading, and then I need to jump into the main part today because we don't have a lot of time left. So 3 more questions.
No.
Or comments?
No?
No? Okay, 2 more questions. No, I'm kidding.
I was just going to relate what we were saying earlier about choices to glitches, and just that I think that the response that you were just talking about to the community manager finding a glitch and then punishing people is exact. I can create an analogy in my mind to a teacher and a student, and the student is oh well, if you kind of go around this way, you can get around the thing and you can solve this, and the teacher is sort of no, that's not the way that we play this game, as opposed to oh, that's interesting that you found that, like, and this is what it entails for the game, and, like, if it breaks the game, then, like, let's discuss why it breaks the game, and maybe we should come up with a different set of rules now that you found that glitch, you know? So I just think the response to those kinds of things is very important in terms of how a student, in the case of an educational game, or a player, in the case of just a game generally, engages with it going forward.
Facebook has put a lot of time in the past couple years into how people respond to not being happy when they're using Facebook, and not like necessarily harassment, but just, you know, you tag a picture of me and it wasn't really the best picture of me in the world, you know. So before it would be like, you know, I could get myself out of it, I could report you, I could ban you. But they started working on this and realized that, well, let's start asking a little bit more in-depth type questions. And what they found was the majority of the time, like 85 to 90% of the time, that when they actually had kind of a question tree on there, that I didn't really want to ban you. But that's all I could see that were my options, were either walk away or ban. Really what it was that I wanted you to understand that it wasn't cool, and that we were going to be all right with that. And there was some mediation that was there, that Facebook just wasn't sitting there with, you know, the whip over the other person going, do you want me to whip them? Do you not want me to whip them? That there wanted to be some subtlety in there. And with the example that you're talking about is a lot about kind of power and control and ego, and putting a little bit more of a system inside there where you can have a conversation about it, whether it's with the student and the teacher, or whether it's a server or an AI inside of a social engine, is an important one. I think that's what we're going towards. I hope that's what we're going towards.
I had just a quick question about Easter eggs in games, and I was wondering if there was any sort of marketing element or engagement element to it. So basically, re-engaging players who've not played the game in a while, or just keeping people engaged because there are these Easter eggs that exist, and you might hear about them in forums, and then you have to kind of finish like the entire game just so that maybe if you didn't notice it the first time, you want to play it again, so you hear it 64 times, and then because you can hear the music the 65th time. And is there that type of thinking when putting in Easter eggs, or is it just like a fun thing to do from the game designers, just because it's more entertainment for the game designer?
Probably most of the latter. Executives tend to hate Easter eggs because they fear. But when I was working at EA, we actually shipped a PGA golf game on, I think it was PlayStation Disc or whatever, and the guy who was doing the builds needed to fill up the space, like data space, and so he had defaulted by putting a Jesus versus Santa Claus video on there. One of the early South Park, one of the very, very early, super, super dirty. He put it in there. Of course, he was going to take it out, but he never did. So they shipped 150,000 copies of this. And once they found it, and it was kind of all over the early internet, they were like, we have to go, we're going to end up in front of Congress, So they had to pull this stuff. And that's what they fear. Okay. But 99% of the stuff is just stuff that developers put in there for fun. And I think it adds more to the lore of a game than to the engagement around it. It becomes a story. There's one game that was like 30 years old where someone found an Easter egg in it recently. It was like an old Atari game or an old...
Mike Tyson's Punch-Out.
Thank you, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, yeah. I knew that you would know. Okay, last one.
What was the Easter egg in that? Yeah. I played that for years.
Oh, it was a way to defeat one of the guys.
The Raging Bull?
Yeah, the crowd gives you a cue.
So this is a game where you're playing as a boxer, and you're supposed to box against this other boxer in the ring, and each boxer has a weakness where if you time the punch just right, you knock them out in one punch.
Yeah.
But you have to figure out when to strike. And in this one player, who's been playing it for decades, figured out that there's one character, there's a sea of 50 faces in the audience in the back. One bearded character, when he ducks, that's exactly what you're supposed to do.
And that's exactly the sort of thing that an engineer would put in back then. So when he's telling someone that they have to go through and beat this, he's just watch the bearded guy. Okay, last one.
I was just saying quickly, Mohammed, from a gamer's perspective, I almost come to expect Easter eggs in games.
Okay.
And so whatever game I have in my hand, I'll go looking for them after I've spent, however many hours in it.
Well, and by the way, I mean, it's also like now, like, because you got PlayStation Network and Xbox One Live and all this other stuff, like, there's a badge for finding the Easter eggs.
Yeah.
Right? There are all these like accomplishments that are part of the game culture that you find the Easter eggs, right?
So think about, just to kind of wrap this conversation up, think about educational technology and online environments and some of the things that we're talking about that I don't really see, like lore and Easter eggs and fairness and glitches. These things, and culture. There's not really like that much of a culture around even EdTech games, unless there's particular ones in the past that we happen to like. And part of those things that are difficult to design for, but that exist because we've created a culture around these things, are a lot of what makes games as a whole kind of endearing to people over the long term. So I'm going to talk about something right now that I use in a lot of my consulting work. And I really need a new title for it because compulsion analysis isn't really the greatest one, but it's a great tool. It's kind of a mashup of several tools that I've used in game design before. And it's basically kind of a shortcut to make sure that your game or your product, someone may be doing like a location-based mobile app, kind of make sure that it has legs, because people don't necessarily tend to think about that. So imagine a hexagon here, and over here you have your core loop. And we've talked about the core loop before, usually 3 to 6 meaningful choices that you're making that lead to a reward that's leading you back into the top of your core loop. Here is, what do you want someone to accomplish by the end of their first session of playing the game or using something? And after I go through these, we'll kind of deconstruct a couple of games and experiences through here. Down here, it's when someone comes back for their next session, this is actually where you lose most of your people. When you look at apps, I mean, like 40 or 42% of apps are never open twice. It's like 13% of them are never open the first time, which seems weird. But this is the big gap right here. I would run into client after client who said, man, we have great one-day engagement. People come and they have lots of fun the first time that they're here. But then like 91% of them don't come back. And I'm like, cool, it must have been pretty fun, if they don't have a reason to come back. And here's where you get into scalability. Why are people coming back after a week? Why are people coming back after a month? This is 30 days. And here is when we're talking like 90 to 180 days or even a year. Why do people keep coming back? So let's do a couple quick deconstructions. Does someone want to pick Words with Friends?
Yes.
What's the core loop of Words with Friends? Very, very short manner.
So you play a word,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get a certain number of points for that word.
Uh-huh.
And then the other guy plays a word, and then you are like notified to like play another word to get another point
Okay.
within one game.
Now this is kind of inside, because I know that you've worked on that game before. By the end of someone's first session, what do you want them to have done?
You want them to have played a lot of words. And you also want them to have like started a lot of new games. So there's like two elements. There's like keep playing one game and start new games. And also invite friends to then play new games.
And that's all first session?
I mean, ideally, but ideally it would be so fun to play a word that you keep on playing.
Okay. Why are they coming back the second time?
Usually, like, the person they're playing with is like played a word and they're like incentivized to like beat the other person.
Okay, so it's because of a notification, they're
Yeah.
being triggered?
Yeah.
By the way, if you don't know, she used to be, you spent a summer, you said?
Yeah, I interned at Zynga doing PM on Words with Friends.
Yeah. Why is someone going to keep coming back? Like they've played some games, they've shared it with their friends, okay, I'm kind of done with it, but why is someone coming back after a week, do you think?
They're coming back because it's either like fun in and of itself to like keep on playing, doing new games.
Okay, so let's assume that it's not. Let's assume that it's not fun. Let's remove the word fun from the equation. What is it actually bringing them back?
There's a lot of notifications that are sent to you to be like, hey, so and so just played a word, like play one back. And then you get like, there's like a leaderboard, and you get higher,
Leaderboard?
like placed higher on the leaderboard, the more points you win.
Why do you think someone's coming back after 30 days?
So those are your intents. So actually another reason why people go back is because it's a really easy thing to do when you're like standing in line or just like killing time.
Okay. Low barrier.
Low barriers, yeah. But I think once you get to 30 days, it becomes kind of a habit. You're used to like when you see the notification, you like come back and like play a word. Like I know, so my dad, for example, is an avid Words with Friends player, and like every night after dinner, he'll just like play Words with Friends. So it's now become like part of his like routine, I guess.
So if we've established a habit by, we're not going to talk addiction, we'll talk habits here. So if we've established a habit at 30 days, sometimes habits can drag down. What's, 3 to 6 months, that's a long time. What's keeping you coming back there? Is it only the habit, or are there other things?
So I think there are network effects as well. So one thing the game tries to do is have, if you log in through Facebook, you can invite your other friends to join, and the more friends you have, the more your friends are inviting you to play new games. And it's actually become a way to actually just keep in touch with different friends, because there's like a message feature as well. And they also just launched this new feature, which is like community games, where you can like almost in Tinder style, like swipe through random people to then play games with them. And it's unclear whether this is another dating app or actually like a Words with Friends thing. Who knows? But regardless, it's like it becomes like it becomes a way to keep in touch with friends over and above just the gameplay, I think.
Okay, this is an important one because we're going to come back to this. So does everyone kind of understand how Words with Friends, which is put out by a professional social game company that knows what they're doing, is moving people from core to their first to their second and through these? You kind of understand that progression a little bit? Who here would consider themselves a power user of Amazon? Raise your hand.
Power user?
Yeah.
Wait, what is
I don't know. What do you think a power user is? Someone had their hand up? Okay, I'm going to hit on you because you seem pretty excited about it. Okay, what's very quickly the core loop of Amazon?
You go on the website, you search for whatever you want, and you immediately find it.
So the funny thing that
literally, I have a thought in my head, it is on there.
So the funny thing is that the core loop of Amazon isn't buying, it is searching.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Okay? So think back when you used it the first time. What do you think you'd want someone to accomplish by the end of their first session?
Buy a book. All the way back in the beginning.
Okay? You want them to complete a purchase.
Yep.
If they don't, you've kind of failed.
I mean, do you want them to complete a purchase, or do you want them to just find what they're looking for?
You want them
I'm guessing that if by the end of someone's first session, if they haven't completed a purchase, that's not considered best.
Yeah, you want them to complete the purchase because then you get their information, and that way you get them to like create an account. Like the account is what you're after. Like by the end of the first session, the critical thing is you want their info.
So I got on there and I found my vacuum cleaner and I purchased it. Why am I ever coming back again?
You received your vacuum cleaner.
Oh, I received it. Okay.
Now you need bags.
in a box?
Yeah, in a branded, nicely packaged box, which makes you feel all the better.
You also received several emails in between that.
It's on the way.
It's being shipped. It's on its way.
It's on the truck.
They
It's
do
delivered.
a lot of contact.
Okay, so they
bought this other thing as well.
Well, that hasn't come yet. That hasn't come yet because you haven't received this yet. So let's talk about, okay, my vacuum cleaner's cool. It cleans stuff up. But this Amazon thing, why am I using it? It's 7 days down. What am I encountering now? People who have bought what you bought.
Also bought these.
Also bought this. What else?
You see what you bought off of Amazon in a store, and the store was more expensive. So you think that it's other things are cheaper.
So now you're starting to do price matching. What are some of the other early engagement tools?
Promotions. I said promotions.
Promotions.
Follows you everywhere. You go to Facebook instead.
It follows you.
Yeah.
Isn't that creepy when you're on someone's like random weather blog and they're like, "You like that Hoover vacuum cleaner?" It's like, I'm not talking about vacuum cleaners right now.
It's called retargeting. There's a name for that.
Yeah.
It's kind of creepy. Okay, so now 30 days. So now you're starting to use it regularly. How is Amazon keeping you involved every 30 days?
You want to write a review.
You want to write a review.
Or comment on other people's reviews.
Right. What's the first thing you do before you want to write a review?
Read other
You want to
reviews.
read the reviews, and then you want to comment on someone else's, and then if you really get your guts, you start writing your own reviews. And if you get really good, you become like a top 100 or top 1,000.
Then you
and
become
now,
fine.
now you're cool to someone.
And for a lot of products, between like the 7 and the 30 days, once you've had time with the product, they send you an email saying, how was that? And it's not for everything, they don't do it for books, but definitely household products have gotten those emails.
Oh.
And then I'm like, oh, well, how was it? I feel so important.
Yeah,
I can tell
they
them.
care about me.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll like, I'll receive something in the mail and it'll be like, if you write a good review, almost.
You got one of those?
Really?
Like, yeah, like I've received this multiple times. It doesn't say explicitly that, but they're like, if you write a positive review, we'll give you this thing for free.
Wow.
Do you write a lot of reviews?
I've written like 2 reviews.
Wow.
Oh.
That's cool. 10 minutes? Okay. Do you need 10 minutes at the end still? Okay.
You do your thing.
So now you're like a power user. 3 to 6 months. How are they keeping you going? The list is almost endless at this point.
Yeah.
Amazon Prime,
Everything.
Amazon Drone, Amazon Music, Amazon Movies, and you start
Right
looking.
now.
And Amazon. And you start looking at Amazon Fresh. You start looking at these things, going, I don't know, $90 a year for Amazon Prime. And once you start adding all the value together, you're like, how can they be doing it this cheaply? Because now I'm ordering from Amazon like every 2 weeks or twice a week if you're like me. They've done a really good job at this.
Whether we're talking about like addiction or habits or whatever, so now they released the dash button, right,
Yes.
which bypasses this core loop altogether.
Have you seen those things?
Yeah, I have
A
one.
one-click shop, right?
It's just a little button.
Genius.
It's a little button, and it'll say like fresh water, or it'll say
Ziploc bags.
or Ziploc bags, or you can get one for Doritos.
Yeah.
So if you walk
You
over
can get one
and
for
you
Izzy's
and you
too.
push the button, and then like a day later, Fritos will show up at your place.
I wonder though if it was something we haven't really talked too much about is like the thing just arriving and the like amazingness of that. So
It's like a present to yourself.
yeah, it's like amazing how excited I'll get from like toilet paper arrived.
Because it's packaged so well.
Well, it's that, and also just like it just seems pretty like incredible that like I have like Amazon Prime. I'm pretty deep in, and I have Prime now, and so like I go on my phone and I can type in a thing and like say, okay, I want a bag of chips and I want this random other thing that I would get from the grocery store, a bunch of other things, and then ice cream, right? And really, I just want the ice cream. But whenever I think I want ice cream, I get triggered to go to my Amazon Prime now and find a bunch of other things so that I can make a big enough package for them to send it to me. Because when I do that,
Once you reach that threshold,
once you reach the threshold, they'll give it to me and it'll be here in 2 hours. And you can watch the driver go to the store, pick up the thing, and drive it to your place. And then it arrives, and it's and it tells you it'll be here between 10 p.m. and midnight, or it'll be here between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m.
right? And it feels like the future.
It does. And then it's a box of the stuff that I clicked on. And how did that happen?
So maybe to bring back up the line between habit and addiction, it sounds like we need an intervention for Colton.
When you're walking around with one of those
I don't have
arms
a
around
problem.
your neck.
That's what they all say.
So I want you guys to think about this because this is
I can stop anytime.
unlike the core loop. This is not a loop. I could have put this out as something stretched. I thought it was more interesting to do it like this. this is all part of the narrative. And when you're building a brand, or you're building a game, or you're building an educational tool that you're using, these are all opportunities for you to engage with the student, engage with the instructor, engage with the technology. These are all ways to add to your story, to add to your culture. And they're all intersection points for engagement. And this is what I deal with the day-to-day basis. How do you keep engagement going?
But like without the core loop, you couldn't have any of that.
Right, right. You could get rid of reviews, and you could get rid of Amazon Prime, and it wouldn't be as awesome. But if that thing of like, I type it in, it's there, I click it, 2 days later it shows up for free or whatever, without that, without the speed of that, because like if you've ever gone and tried to buy the same thing from someone else, and they're like, oh, you need to fill out our thing. Oh, well, it's going to take 2 weeks to get there. And you're like, 2 weeks? Like, what century do you live in? You know? They don't have that core loop in there. So you're exactly right. So before we go, the game critiques. Has anyone looked at the assignment yet? You have an assignment? Okay. Look at the assignment. The assignment's due 1 o'clock on Wednesday. It's about taking several games, one analog, one digital,